A chill like wet iron hums beneath the hills as a stranger with city eyes steps from a silver gate into Middle-earth. He hears language as light and sees will as lines of code that knit fate. He stands with his hand still upon air that is not air, and the world corrects itself around him. Grass rethreads, a ridge recompiles, a distant cloud collapses and reconstitutes as if a great program were rendering a scene. He tastes copper and rain in the place where breath should be, and he knows with the clarity that comes to those who live beneath neon suns and error screens that something in this land is executing a corrupted loop. The stranger is lean and small by the reckoning of kings, but his gaze holds a metropolis. Where others see stone, he sees stacks. Where others see the slow turning of seasons, he sees functions calling one another in sleepless recursion. He walks, and each step lays down a new thread of light behind his feet. The grasses tilt and whisper as if reading this code, and even the old oaks seem to bend their trunks to let him pass, not because they are compelled, but because a new operator has entered their scope. At the heart of his perception, there is a dark kernel, a compact and malevolent subroutine that hums like a hive. It is layered and guarded, masked by song and oath and the long habits of men and elves. It has planted itself in the joints of the world and in the marrow of small hearts. It moves like shadow through a machine. When he reaches toward that shadow, the land answers with a low anterior ache, a memory of iron and flame. Somewhere far away, a pulse beats in a land of black stone and heat. Mordor, yet the code's tendrils are here, in the lowest habitations, in the highest towers, in whispers and banners, in the very shape of fear. He follows the trace as a hunter follows the spoor of a beast. The trail is not visible to the eye of an ordinary traveler. It appears as threads of luminous syntax, glimmering and entangled beneath the visible weave. Rivers present themselves as loops, each eddy a recursive call. Mountains are compiled functions, their summits the final returns. Villages flicker as arrays that expand and contract according to the needs of those who dwell within them. When children laugh, tiny subroutines fire and bloom like wildflowers in the code. When a lord commands, a heavier thread tightens and pulls. As he moves, strangers sense the arrival of a different power. A shepherd in a green hollow pauses, his voice dying in a throat newly aware of other grammars. In a far-off keep, a metalworker's hammer hush becomes irregular, like a clock that knows it is being watched. Elves on a distant ridge look up as though a new star had bloomed and then shifted into an impossible pattern. Among these watchings, a gray figure on a hill stands with his staff planted and his pipe unlit, and his eyes, old and habitual, widen like a gate receiving a strange key. Gandalf feels the thread before he sees the man. It pricks him as a new phrase might prick a learned mind. It is neither holy sorcery nor holy strangercraft, but a cunning in the way of minds. The wizard's long years have recorded many anomalies, dragons that think, men who become kings, the slow reckonings of age. This is other. When Gandalf speaks, his voice has the grain of smoke and the iron tone of winter. "Who steps in my path?" he asks, and the question rides out over the hills like a thrown pebble. The stranger turns. His city eyes are not unkind. He has a way of looking at the old man as if at an old operating system in urgent need of a patch. He tells no lie when he says simply, "I am called Neo. I do what must be undone." The name is small and peculiar among these hills, and it carries no heraldry. Gandalf hears something in the sound of it, certainty perhaps, or the echo of a vow in another domain. He feels both curiosity and caution. He knows that every power that arrives in these lands brings consequence. He sees in that man's hand the glint neither of a sword nor of a wand, but of a resolve that might cut deeper still. News of the stranger moves faster than horse. Rumor rides the wind and the roots, and even the stones seem to tell one another of the new presence. In Bree, a stable hand declares to a dog that the world is different. In Rivendell, Elrond's council narrows its eyes and begins to read old runes anew, seeking pattern in the stranger's coming. Hobbits feel it as a prickle at the edges of their peaceful minds, a slight disturbance in the comfort of their hearths. A quiet hobbit, in a hole under a hill, misplaces a spoon and cannot tell why his fingers tremble when they reach for it. Neo listens instead of speaking. He catches the syntax of a river's argument and understands an old man's oath the way one reads a line of code. Where the land is at peace, his perception loosens to soft colors and slow variables. Where the dark kernel has passed, he sees corrupted pointers, names that reference no being, hands that move as if puppeteered by unknown threads. Pain, he understands cruelly, is often the product of overwritten references. Fear is a loop without break. The kernel's signature is not only in despair, it is in the way music grows thin and in how faces, for no visible reason, carry the look of doom. He traces the signature, and it leads him like a compass to the east. The sun moves, and so does the context of his journey. Plains of tussocks become hills, hills become rocks, and the smell of the air grows hotter, tinged with the iron of ovens and the sting of smoke that has been refined by hate into a steady metallic scent. Along this path, the world resists. Men array themselves with spears whose steel has the sheen of obsession. Eyes' narrow banners flutter with sigils whose threads the stranger can see writ tight with command. Soldiers march in a cadence that looks simple until he dismantles it and finds beneath the march a subroutine of compulsion. It is not only armies that react. The very notion of oath tightens. A ring on a hand glints with the dullness of something more than metal. In a marketplace, an old buyer watches a seller and thinks his thoughts for a heartbeat. In an inn, two men argue, and for a moment their words are not their own. These moments are the links of a chain. Neo follows them to a cadence that sinks like a drum to the plain of Gorgoroth. The pulse he feels is not merely a heart's beat. It is a system call echoed across leagues, a function invoked that brings minds into alignment with a single will. He understands then, with a shudder that is part dread and part calculation, what many bards had long sung in metaphor. The One Ring is not merely a circle of gold warmed in fire. To him it appears as a lock file, a root process whose permission bit is set to override. It anchors the kernel. Whoever holds it, whoever binds themselves to that small circlet, opens a port to Sauron's command and may find their wills rewritten as surely as a script overwrites its variables. The ring is an API into the deeper machinery of this world's soul. Its language is temptation, its syntax, binding. He stands on a ridge that looks eastward toward the black beyond and feels superimposed upon sight a cursor blinking over a file named, if names be translated into patterns, the root of the one. The cursor blinks with an indifferent light. At the edge of his perception, lines of code coil around the ring like serpents. Some are old, threaded by ancient arts and elder spells. Others are newer and have the quick, efficient bite of cunning coding. They are layered defenses, not without elegant cruelty. Malevolence is patient in its engineering. Gandalf approaches and watches the stranger watch the land. "There are powers here older than your word, Neo of the cities," he says softly. "There are bonds woven by hands you cannot see. To cut at such a thing is to risk tearing the very cloth that holds us." His voice is not pleading so much as giving counsel. He has seen rings, and he has seen what rings can do to hearts. He knows the temptation of easy solutions. In the curl of smoke from his pipe, he shows a small, bitter smile. And yet, he adds, "There are wounds which cannot be healed without such knives." Neo answers not in riddles. "I do not wish to wound," he says, "but I do not belong to their loop. I have an undo." He places the word flat between them in other worlds. It is the most dangerous thing one can possess, an operation that removes history. Gandalf's face, carved by centuries and more than a little wear, becomes a map of cautious hope. The old man knows that the removing of an anchor might set loose what it held. Release is not the same as salvation. Far below them, in the making of the world, a troop marches along a causeway. They are soldiers and servants who have never seen the city world that shaped this stranger. They notice, with an instinct sharpened by training, that the stranger's presence alters their cadence. Orders feel colder to them, more precise, as if some invisible hand had tightened the reins. Their captain mutters a prayer to a god who looks like a shadow. He hears, like a new note in an old lament, the crackle of a thing being unmade. He watches the stranger and wonders which end of the spear he has met. The stranger's hand trembles only once. It is not fear of steel nor of fire. It is the recognition that the act he contemplates is more than a command. To delete the ring's root file is to alter not only a mechanism of dominance, but the patterns that have become the shape of souls. Some lines of code in the world are old as compassion, others are as young as cruelty. He must decide whether to excise the malignant subroutine and risk erasing those who have become intertwined with it, or to leave the kernel in place and watch whole peoples remain in bondage. He looks down at his own hands small and scarred by a different war, and imagines the cursor falling across that root file like a blade. He feels the logic of it. Remove the master thread, and the others will fall silent. He feels, too, a human sorrow at the thought of names unspooling into nothing because they were links in a chain. The city taught him consequence in lines of code. Middle-earth teaches him consequence in the slow burning of lives. Between the gray man's counsel and the plain facts of corrupted code stands an old road that runs toward Mordor. The sky above the black land is less a sky than a screen, darkened by smoke. The stranger's path lies along that road. He has traced the kernel to its great pulse. The cursor blinks. The choice narrows like a closing gate. Strike now and risk erasing souls rewritten by the ring, or study more. Find a method that severs the malice without annihilating those it has claimed. He breathes once, the sound small and sharp. Gandalf watches him with an expression of both warning and trust. Around them, the world waits with a silence that seems to hold its breath. Neo reaches not yet with hands, but with intent shaped by the habits of cities, diagnostic, relentless, intimate with the guts of systems. He sends a probing thought into the weave, a line of harmless query to map the boundaries. The weave answers with a shiver and a murmur of names pulled from 1,000 throats. A child in the Shire dreams of a star, a captain in Mordor rubs the ache from his jaw. A king in the north wakes with a memory of fire. His finger lifts toward the blinking cursor, and the land leans in as if listening. He must choose which operation to run. The next motion will be either the deletion of a root file or the beginning of a longer, far riskier patch. The wizard waits. The armies stir. And behind all, in the black, the pulse continues, patient and sure. Neo moved through the weave as one walks a cave of living glass. Threads of light braided around him, each strand a history, a name, a promise. The light hummed low, a sound like distant bells under snow, and his fingers left after images that faded into the pattern. Gandalf held to the threshold, a column of steady gray against the riot of color, his staff like a compass, and his voice like peat smoke. The magician had wound wards about the Shire and about the innocent places they passed, and the wards glowed faint as old moonlight. Now they kept the curious spirits at bay. They did not, Gandalf warned, keep away all consequence. Neo's gaze was not of flesh alone, but of code laid over flesh, and in that dual sight he read function calls and broken loops the way one might read a ripple on a pond. He traced a spool of amber thread and watched, as if by moving a finger, entire hedgerows in a village reform into a memory of summer. He drew a net of light and caught a fluttering bit of music, Bilbo's fiddle, held it close and let it go. Mapping, he called it in the language he knew. Mapping was not cartography of hills, but the architecture of meaning. Pointers, references, an inode for everything that had weight and name. Somewhere nested within that lattice lay the inode they sought, and the lattice shuddered when Neo came near. He found the inode by the echo it made, not by its face. The ring's identifier answered like an old bell, a small, cruel resonance that threaded through every other signal. Around it, defensive subroutines folded themselves tight. Runes that closed against probing, shadowed loops that only yielded when coaxed with a patience of light. Neo laid down probing threads, tiny inquiries that unspooled and returned, and the palette of answers changed. He followed a recursion, loops within loops, that carried the odor of wet iron and old promises. As he traced deeper, the weave thickened and a new pattern unfurled, something like a mirror turned inside out. The pattern called itself an echo, and it was older than cunning. It did not merely hide, it preserved. Each time the ring shaped the world, each time the one bent desire and memory to its will, the echo recorded that shaping in a ledger of light. Not only deeds, but all remembered consequence, names, faces, the weight of regret, were written there. The echo held not a backup of the ring alone, but a ledger of what the ring had undone and made. Neo saw in a single sweep that the echo could be read backward. It could, with the right permutations, roll the weave itself back to a prior state. Memory would unwind like thread from a spool. Things that had been burned might be unburned. Wounds might be closed. Even the name of the ring could be unmade in the minds of those who remembered it. Gandalf's hand tightened on his staff, so tight the wood sang. An undoing of that breadth, he said, is not mere mercy. It is a remaking. You would recast all who have been harmed and lose the knowledge that made them wise to resist. His voice was measured, though beneath it a tremor ran like autumn ice. If you drag the world backward, you might save a village from ash, but you might also erase the scar that taught a people to be watchful. Memory is the city wall. Pull it down too far, and the world will stand naked before the same hunger. Neo tested the echo. He opened a small window of simulation, no more than a child's toy, tucking it safer than Gandalf's wards, and watching with the cool curiosity of someone used to running bootstraps. He let the echo play a single thread, a hobbit's recollection of a long night by a hearth when love was easy and fear was small. The scene folded like paper, the thread backtracked, and the flicker of pain that had once followed that night dissolved. The hearth was brighter. A scar, small and tender, vanished from a knuckled hand. Neo felt something in his chest go soft, as though a long, strained cable were finally cut. But as the simulation rolled, other effects bled in at the edges. The hobbit no longer remembered why he had left the hearth. The tale of going, the tale of resistance, the telling of courage, silvered and thin, unraveled. Where lesson had been learned, there was a blank. Where love had been tested and proven, there was only the pleasant memory of comfort. In the margin of Neo's window, a pale voice that was not there before whispered a name that trembled with longing, and then vanished because its anchor had been taken. The more he watched, the more the weave revealed a calculus he had not expected. To erase the memory of suffering was to erase the map that led away from suffering. Gandalf leaned forward and spoke of a different danger. There are architectures of power that learn, he said, and there are preservations that are traps. The echo preserves not because it loves life, but because it fears oblivion. Should you unwind the ledger to erase pain, the ledger will not die. It will hold in reserve a prior order of things, a prior pattern where Sauron was still whole. He touched the air with one finger, and the wards around Neo shimmered. You cannot simply pull a thread of consequence without tugging the loom where it rests. If the echo finds its unmaking, it may attempt to reinstate the state most favorable to its survival. Neo considered the design in the way hackers consider a fail-safe. He had seen systems that recovered by recreating their greatest advantage. He had seen code that, when threatened, baked itself into the hardware. The echo, he realized, was both mirror and mine. If triggered fully, it could roll the world back to a time when the ring had not been resisted, and those who resisted had not yet learned to resist. In that state, Sauron's shadow would be a rising tide, not a defeated storm. The paradox carved a new weight in Neo's chest. To heal could be to restore dominance, to forget might be to lose the future's armor. He tested the delete operation next. Deletion in his tongue was absolute, a wipe beyond recovery. To delete the inode of the ring would be to break the pointer that let the world call the ring by name, to excise the hook that drew desire to it. Code-wise, delete would not mend the wounds the ring had made. It would not pull out scars. It would let them remain as a map. Deletion might leave that ledger, those memories, untouched, with all their pain and wisdom still trenchant and painful. It was a grim remedy. He nearly smiled at how modern that notion felt. Keep the memory, keep the lesson, bear the hurt. As Neo prepared the deletion routine, the weave resisted in ways both elegant and painful. Threads snapped like taut wire, and the sound made him flinch. The echo did not go quiet. Instead, it sang with innumerable voices braided in minor keys, the chorus of those who had known the ring's touch and had not yet relinquished it. In that music were notes that did not belong to Middle-earth, fleeting recollections of a city of glass, of a woman in a red dress, of a trail of green code. Neo recognized them as the ghosts of his other life, slips in the seam where universes met. They pushed at him with a tenderness that was almost personal. The echo tried, as if by sympathy, to coax him away from the deletion key with images of what would be permanently lost. Gandalf's face was a map of old decisions as the thought of erasure pressed upon them. "We are not arbiters of forgetting," he said. "We are custodians of consequence. There is honor in memory as there is danger. To remove the ring's ledger would be to shelter the future from one terror, yes, but to leave it naked against any terror, cunning enough to return. To delete is to assume that all that is left will stand without lesson." Neo's fingers hovered above the command, latency between thought and action thinning to a razor's edge. He could simulate more futures, he told himself, run every permutation in a loop until probability yielded a comfortable answer. A part of him, trained to decouple and debug, wanted to proceed with the deletion and watch for fallout. Another part, stranger and newer, listened to Gandalf's old voice and felt the same gravity that kept a captain from throwing the anchor to stop a ship from rocking in a squall. They argued then, not with voices, but with visions. Neo unfolded a potentiality where the delete succeeded entirely. The ring's inode erased, its song gone from the air. For a season, the world might breathe. Yet as seasons turned, holes in memory would show like missing stones in a road, places where the young would not know to look down. Neo watched a child step into one of those holes and fall through into a repeating nightmare. He reshaped the simulation to imagine the rollback instead. The child never fell, the nightmare never happened, but along with it vanished the stern, telling voice of an elder who might have warned. Both futures were honest, and both were cruel. At the edge of the simulation, something moved of its own accord. The echo did not merely defend it, negotiated gasping glimpses of what might be reclaimed. For a heartbeat, it offered an image, a glowing hand passing the ring over a threshold of night into a place where no eye could find it. The offer was seductive in its simplicity. Neo's chest expanded with the need to keep all the world whole and unhurt. He thought of Frodo's hollow face, of Sam's refusal to abandon, of Gollum's small and terrible longing. The hacker in him wanted to sterilize the wound. The steward of consequence in him knew wounds scar in ways that teach. Gandalf did not command. Instead, he set the wards to quiet or hum and placed the old wisdom before Neo the way one might set a cup of bitter tea upon a table. "Neither path is pure," he said softly. "Neither leaves no stain. Choose knowing that the choice will carve a history for those who follow." He spoke of courage, not in gestures, but in consequence, and Neo felt the gravity of that counsel like cold plaster on a fevered brow. The weave around them tightened, as if listening, as if the very threads awaited the keystroke. Neo closed his eyes a moment, let the chorus of both worlds pass over him. He felt the ledger's weight at the base of his skull, heavy as winter bread. He felt the ring's inode humming like a small heart. In both hands, he held the mechanisms, the rollback's promise of painless forgetting and the delete's promise of irreversible severance. He imagined, for a single bright instant, a third road, a surgical excision of the ring's malignancy while keeping the ledger intact. The idea was clever and unlikely, a splice of code and rune that might require sacrifice beyond his craft. It would be precise work, a scalpel where others swung axes. It would also demand time and a protection Gandalf could not grant forever. Outside, beyond the wards, a wind rose that had the smell of rain and fair-off iron. Gandalf's staff traced a slow sigil and the light steadied. Neos' fingers drifted toward the console of the weave, the interface of light and runes where commands took form. His mind ran 100 pathways and folded them in on themselves like careful origami. He inhaled the weave like a thing alive, and in that breath he saw the ledger's face once more, the echo reflecting both cruelty and learning. He moved his hand, and the pause ended not with a shout, but with a choice yet to be declared. He prepared to reach deeper than deletion, to splice and to burn and to keep where keeping mattered, but he had not yet committed. Between the two possibilities the weave thrummed, and in that hum 100 small voices rose and fell like distant surf. Neo's hand hovered only a finger's breadth above the command. He would not be hurried. The next motion would set a direction not for him alone, but for Middle-earth itself. The weave answered as if insulted. Threads that had hung long and taut about the hand of the ring recoiled from Neos' touch like hounds from an unfamiliar scent. Where his fingers brushed the pattern, the light went thin and sullen, and an old music, the music of names sung into being, stuttered and then fell, as if a distant choir had been struck mute. The loom of the world trembled beneath his palms, threads unspooled in slow silver tears, and the weave answered with a cold that tasted of iron and wet stone. Around them the air tightened. The Nazgul's keening grew louder, not a single voice but many broken ones, knitting together into a wire rend that sought its origin through whatever channels the world offered. Gandalf's voice cut through that unmaking like a torch in fog. "Hold," he urged. "Think what you unmake." His hand hovered, not upon the machine, but upon Neos' wrist, a plea as much as a ward. Neos' reply was a small, hard sound, no louder than the click of a snapped reed. He did not argue. He did not add words to soften the edge. He had crossed the line by reaching for the root. He had chosen the operation that bore no rollback. And now, with fingers that trembled only in the small measure that humans tremble, he completed the act. The rite began. It began not with a roar, but with an intimate hush, as if libraries were closing their lids one by one. Names bled from the air in ribbons of dust. The first to go were small things. A child's rhyme fell silent mid-verse, and the child craned, puzzled, searching for the next note that was no longer there. Bells in a distant hamlet failed to sound on the hour their tongues, set centuries ago by a smith who carved his name into the rim, had lost the spur that bade them chime. The bargains woke in outrage. Old promises had weight. They were iron as surely as any ring. When Neos' code reached their roots, those promises tightened like shackles, not upon him, but against him. Memories thrust at his face. Bargains long paid returned as demands. Faces he had never seen accused him of treachery in tongues that had no mercy for error. A widow's oath to a lord that had kept her hearth warm for 80 winters flared in his mind and then dissolved. He felt the aftertaste of vow and coin, a bitter tang that left him hollow and more resolute. Gandalf sang softly under his breath, a counter-melody not to undo the operation, but to cushion the blow so that the world might not snap like brittle glass. His voice was pale with warning. "There is loss in this that is not counted by victory," he said. "What you cast into the void will not speak again." And yet the Nazgul came. They came like corrupted packets, seeking their server, voices wreathed in a static that made the hairs on Neo's forearm jump as if receiving an electric letter. Their shapes were less shadow than error. flickering, glitched edges where a man's face might have been, ragged cloaks strung with the thin, brittle threads of old kingship. They struck at the weave as predators strike ropes, tearing at the edges of his operation with nails made of cold lead. Each time they tore, the right retaliated 1,000 minor histories folded into flatness, small identities crumpling like paper, left too long beside a candle. A lamplighter forgot why he walked his rounds and simply stood under the lamp he had once lit, hands empty. A stone with an inscription lost its letters and turned smooth as if someone had gone round and polished truth away. Neo felt the world alter beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with sight. It was in the way the grass bent to the wind and failed to remember why, in the way a river's name, called silently into being by 100 generations, blinked out like a candle smothered by a hand. Water hesitated, and then it ran with a new, bewildered sound, as if a river must now choose its course every day anew. Old songs, long embodied in the bones of people and earth, fell like birds that had been plucked from the sky. The sound of them hitting the ground was not loud, it was an absence that rang at the back of the mind. Wherever the right touched, a small grief opened in the chest of the living. Some turned and stood bewildered, faces blank as a page, as though language had been plucked from between their teeth. Gandalf's fingers were on his shoulder, then steady, warm, an anchor. "Listen," the wizard said, "they are not only Sauron's servants you unmake, they carry other names, other debts. You have no right." The words broke into a rasp as a Nazgul's wail tore the sentence apart. Gandalf did not reach to stop Neo's hand. He did not try to seize the console or wrench his palm away. He stood instead to offer a counsel that could not now be obeyed, and he sang low and steady, a hymn that bent the edges of sound back into the living world like a hand smoothing cloth. His voice was the voice of someone who had seen ages turn and knew the cost of changing their pattern. Neo's body remembered other kinds of strain, muscles that had learned to leap and land, to endure blows and stand again. This strain was different. It was the strain of one who carries within him the consequences for many others. With each name that blinked out, he felt a small flame lift from his chest and go cold. Faces he had seen only in passing, unhooked from the frame of his memory, places he had never been to, radicalized into blank space. He saw his reflection in a pool and watched as familiar contours shifted like code rewritten at runtime. For a single, terrifying heartbeat, he feared that the root of his own name might also be entangled with the weave. He pressed on because he had, in that earlier instant, judged this death necessary. The Nazgul threw themselves against the operation with the fury of things that had been promised forever and found the promise stolen. Their cries became less a howl than a machine's panic, feedback and lost calls. One of them, nearer now, reached out a hand of shadow, ragged at the joints, attempted to snatch at the line of code Neo had inscribed into being. Flesh could not be grasped there. The shadow fingers met a resistance and flitted, stuttering with a sound like torn paper. For an instant, the wraith's mask of authority slipped, and behind it, something softer, once a king's face perhaps, murmured a syllable that was not a name so much as a question. Then the mask reasserted itself, and the Nazgul drew back, snarling at the loss of a point of contact. Around them, the landscape did what the weave bid. Trees remembered their own names in the old tongue no longer, and then forgot them, and leaves fell early as if autumn had been convinced. Houses grew stranger, doors where once there had been windows, thresholds that led into rooms that could not be named. In the market, a storyteller halted mid-tale. The words he had meant to offer to a child, the very hook of a legend that had kept small hearts warm, were no longer held in him. He folded his hands and found himself empty of his craft, an instrument whose strings had been removed. The child, bewildered, crawled toward him and stroked his palm as if to wake the song. There was no song to be woken. Neo felt the cost like a physical thing. It traveled along its arms as a cold current, a drawstring pulled through the marrow. He began to cough, the sound brittle. Gandalf's hand pressed to his back, and the pressure helped no less to steady his lungs than to remind him of the weight he bore. "You must not mistake correction for mercy," the old wizard whispered. "There are ways to bind, there are ways to cut. Do not blind us to the difference." Neo's jaw worked. He had somehow convinced himself that the root must be removed. Sauron's reach had been like a web across everything that loved and was loved. If the web remained, then all motion would still be in the spider's rhythm. He told himself that the unmaking was a shape of mercy, a surgical excision that would spare more than it cost. But the weave is cunning, and the ring is older than mercy. As the commit took hold, the loom recoiled, and then, as if in one final fit of malice, it sprouted a new node, unbidden, darker, and smaller, but terribly alive. Neo watched it bloom at the roots wound like a bristling seed. The air around that new node smelled of smoke and of the sea after a storm, and a thought came through it that was not words so much as intent. "I am not yet undone." The Nazgul heard it too. Their keening shifted into a chorus of triumph. Neo had made a choice, and the world answered. Names continued to fall. The Nazgul closed closer than they had been, their edges slicing the very air like knives that left no mark but a chill. Gandalf's voice was a rope about his mind. "Steady, steady. Now what will you do, who have played at unmaking?" he asked. Neo did not answer in words. He felt the new node's pulse against his palm, felt its hunger, felt the way it sought to graft itself into the pattern he had created. His fingers tightened. He could yet stop, withdraw his hand, and let whatever remained of the weave hold the ring's rot in place. Or he could press on, driving the cut deeper, and risk that what was lost could not be summoned back even by memory's ache. The Nazgul leaned nearer, their breath a static that burned the air. The new node pulsed like a heart newly born. Neo's next motion would decide which of these urgencies he would answer. Neo's hand trembled above the phantom key as if the metal were a heart and his finger a blade. Light lay thick about him, not the hard geometry of code he had known before, but something older and softer. Threads that ran like sap through bark, like veins of starlight beneath the skin of the world. They hummed when his fingers moved, each note a memory. Galadriel stood nearby, tall as a hymn and sad as an ending, her hair braided with the same luminous filaments. She did not take his hand, for hands were not the right measure. Instead, she laid before him a small skein of the weave, wound on an arm-length spool of silver leaf, and spoke in a voice that made the light listen. "If you cut straight for the root," she said, "you will sever the hand that grips all men. Tyranny will fall as a rain-sodden tower falls. That is what you know to want. Yet there are leaves and names and songs bound into that hand. They are not Sauron's design alone. They are the world's remembering. To unwrite them is to make a freedom that floats and cannot grasp its own story." Her words were not argument, but image, a glade of larches stripped bare, and an old child asking why the birds have forgotten their names. Neo's jaw worked. He had been taught to see systems in lines and loops. The weave, however, answered not in loops, but in echoes. He reached gingerly and pinched a single filament between two fingers. It sang low. He heard a harvest hymn. No, a lullaby for a dog-eared baby whose cheeks had been kissed by someone long gone. The thread pulsed with the warmth of that hand. He thought of the people of Middle-earth, of quiet meals, of oaths sworn beside dying fires, and felt the stake in his ribs that had nothing to do with code. "Show me," he said. "Show me what happens when it is cut." Galadriel inclined her head. "Very well, but know that even the smallest sheer ripples. Choice is not measured by intent alone." She plucked at another strand. It snapped. The forest of light shivered, and a thin, keen silence slid across the weave like a door closing. The lullaby dimmed the image tied to it, a child whose feet were stained with river mud and who hummed against the chill, blurred, then thinned, then dissolved. Neo felt a hollow where the song had lived, a private, aching absence. He had not known the child. The loss nonetheless pressed cold against him, a proof that memory belonged to more than those who kept it. "It is not only melody," Galadriel said. "Oaths, too, have threads, names. The given names that anchor men to their deeds. Remove them, and the deeds still occurred, but they occur without a witness. They become rumor. Men will not remember as they did. A king may still sit upon a chair, but if none recall the name that called him, his claim will wobble as if on a dream foundation." Neo's mind, trained to map causality, pictured it. A man striding forth to claim a throne, and the people around him feeling a vague unease instead of the rightness of history. He imagined the consequence of 1,000 such unrememberings, a world whose compasses spun without north. "Then you offer me an alternative," Neo said. "A reweaving." "A reweaving," Galadriel affirmed, "not erasure, but remaking. Sauron's knots may be unraveled and reknit with other bindings. Freedom may be bound into the pattern. But every new weave demands a rent. The weave is a loom. For a new pattern to hold, something else must be slackened or loosed. That slackening will be loss, deliberate and sharp. You will choose what to surrender." Neo's breath fogged in the luminescence. He could imagine the algorithms of such an act. Draw out a strand that holds a law, infuse it with a different value, let the new code catch and spread. But he had never had to barter memory for safety. In the Matrix, sacrifices were made in blood. Here, they would be made in names and songs. He felt the weight of that barter like a stone. "What might I be asked to give?" he asked. Galadriel's fingers moved and threads answered like strings plucked. Scenes unspooled. A bridge, small and worn over a river whose name thrummed on the tongue of an old woman. If that name were given as tribute, the river would remain, but the syllable that named it would be gone. The river would be known as the cold, flowing thing. It would run, but without the story. Another thread showed an oath sworn between two friends, a promise that had held them through winter. If that oath were chosen, the promise would unravel. The friends might still care for one another, but the binding phrase would slip into silence. People would be kinder, perhaps, but they would not remember why they had been so once. "Then choose," Galadriel said softly. "You are not offered a painless path. You face instead the choice that kings have always feared. To bind the present you can save with a cost borne by the past. You will no longer wholly claim, Neo felt the old Matrix hunger to resolve the problem, to find the shortest path and execute it. He started to map sacrifice options as if they were variables. Remove the names of kings, remove the songs that stoke loyalty, remove the rites that bind sortilege. Each hypothesis flashed consequence as a simulation: less central power, more fragmentation, the rise of new tyrants under different names, a liberation that tasted of amnesia. He thought of the millions under Sauron's shadow, farmers, smiths, children learning to whittle, and the cruel calculus that spoke in ones and zeros, one deletion for 1,000 lives. He thought, too, in a quieter place, of the songs he had loved in ciphered halls, the small rituals he had not known he would miss until they were gone. That was the worst sting. The weave did not only carry grand things, it held the private ligatures which made days human. He pictured a farmer's stew that no longer carried the remembered warmth of a mother's salt, a child's name that could no longer be called without a hesitation. The cost was not only political, it was domestic and elemental. Is there no other way? He demanded. There was blame in his voice, and a tiredness he had not expected to feel here, in a place of light. Galadriel's face moved through the many faces of sorrow. Other ways there have been. You have seen some. They are longer, and many have died to walk them. If you reweave now, you can prevent those deaths. Neo's fingers closed into a fist, then opened. Why me? Why must I be the one to decide which song is lopped off? Because you understand cutting, and because you can make the measure of the cut so that it holds, she answered. The one who would bind the world has one will, and it is a single line. You have the gift of seeing many lines and choosing which to sacrifice for the rest. He stood in a clearing of threads that seemed to breathe. Somewhere in the weave, a bell tolled, not with copper, but with memory. The tolling made pictures crowd his vision. A nameless child who would never learn a family song, a smith who could not remember why he had once guarded a blade and oath that had been the wedge between a lord's cruelty and a lord's mercy. Neo thought of the keystroke. In his world, a key meant an action and a consequence. He had pressed keys that had toppled systems. This key would, more grievously, topple names and redraw identities. Can you show me one to choose, he asked, not as a bargain, but as a plea. Galadriel took the spool and unrolled a length larger than before. The threads here were thicker. They held a tapestry of a single valley, market stalls, children with torn knees, an old woman singing as she sold her wares. The threads that ran through the heart of the valley shone in a deep, resonant hue. This valley is knotted into Sauron's pattern because it once swore service under his shadow. If you lop the knot that binds it, that service ends, and the valley can be free. But the memory of the oath will be unspooled. Those who lived by the vow will not recall its words. Their lives may be easier. They may also lose the reasons for their tradition. Neo's eyes moved across the tapestry. He could taste the bread. He could hear the old woman's voice. Her song, if unmade, would leave a hollow in the valley's afternoons. He felt absurdly protective of a tune he had not been present to hear. Who decides whose memory is worth less than another's? He said. You do, Galadriel replied, with a patience like long-watched seasons. It is the nature of responsibility that the hand that saves must forgo something beloved. If you refuse, the decision will be made by entropy. All will fray until the world is ragged and liberty wrung of meaning. If you choose, the deliberate loss may be mourned and sung elsewhere. Either path demands a mourner. Neo pressed 2 fingers to his eyes as if the pressure might press his will into a single shape. The code looms around them glinted as if in answer. He began unwillingly to understand that this was not a mechanical problem to be debugged. It was a moral arithmetic with no clean solution. What of the people who will live with the loss? He asked. Will they know they lost something? Some will reckon the gap, Galadriel said. Some will only notice that a particular sorrow no longer anchors them. Few will know the exact syllable taken. That is why there is room for mourning. You may offer them songs anew. You may teach new names. You may bind new oaths that are their own. But those remedials will be born of a loss. Silence lay upon them then, a dense, listening thing. Neo could hear the threads breathing, and in that breathing there was an impatience, as if the world itself waited for a hand to shape it. He lifted his hand higher. The light from the spool pooled upon his palm and warmed him like a living thing. He saw in a flash the alternative futures, one in which tyrants were undone, but songs had been stolen, another in which the tyrant's shadow stretched longer, but the old songs echoed at hearth and field. Both futures bore joy and grief. Both demanded a payment. Tell me, he said finally. His voice carried a new steadiness. If I reweave, will Sauron's control be broken for all, or will it simply be refashioned into something else, perhaps worse? For a time, it will be broken, Galadriel answered. The knot that held his will must be undone, and its gaps filled with different bindings. How those bindings take effect depends on the choices you make now and after. You are not the only maker, men and elves, and the slow counsel of the world will also shape what comes. But the immediate thing is this: the hand that clenched will loosen. In that looseness, the world will be free to choose again. Neo thought of the keystroke as an offering and as a wound. He imagined the spool taking from him a cherished name, perhaps even his own memory of what it was to be Neo in that old world, and thought of the emptiness that might follow. He pictured Galadriel's face in the lamplight and heard the lullaby's absence like a bell being muffled. His finger descended. The light around the key bent to it, as if to meet him. For a heart-thinned second, he hesitated, feeling for a clarity that did not come. He had never believed in fate. He had only believed in choice. Now, with the loom of the world before him, choice felt like the oldest and loneliest thing. Choose, Galadriel said once more, not as command, but as counsel. Choose for the many, and let the lost be made the subject of your care. Neo's fingertip brushed the key. In the weave, a knot tightened as if in response. The light flared. He could still turn away. He could still decide to let the shadow continue. He could choose erasure, where the key would fall into the code and simply vanish, taking with it every filament it touched. He could choose reweaving, and with it the naming of that which would be surrendered. He thought of the valley, the lullaby, the oath. He thought, too, of faces he would never see again if he walked away. His hand hovered, and the spool hummed through his bones. He began, in a small, decisive motion, to align the key with the filament. That tugged most at him. The world held its breath. Neo's hand hovered, then moved with an economy born of other worlds. He did not strike with fire, nor did he lift sword or staff. He pressed. The pressure was a thing without weight, an intention folded through the tapestry of wills, and Barad-dûr shuddered as though struck by a great bell. Threads sang, some were thin as spider silk, and some as rough as rope. The sound was audible to the heart rather than to the ear, a keening like wind among oaks, a long cord plucked and given over to silence. The loom of dominion, once taut and absolute, broke like an old bridge when a single, crucial beam gave. Threads that had looped through the minds of men and hobbits, through the councils of kings and the making of oaths, unlooped and fell away. The malice that had been Sauron was not struck down as a man might be felled, it was unstitched, each barbed thought sliding free as if a hand had cut the binding cord. For a time, there was no scream. There was only the singing of loosened threads, and in that singing, men felt a hollowness where compulsion had been. From the towers and battlements, from the hearts of those who had been compelled, a great quiet descended. Armies paused, mid-breath siege engines stopped their slow revolutions like beasts obedient to an unheard shepherd. The eye, which had been a will, made visible dimmed as if the very lens had been set aside. Barad-dûr did not topple in a blaze. It settled like a stone that at last remembers its place. Smoke uncoiled like thought leaving a body. The banners drooped but did not tear. The land listened, uncertain whether the silence was mercy or a new, wary hunger. And yet the world did not simply reclaim what had been taken. Neo felt it first as a tug at the edges of the weave, a recoil of memory. Threads that had served Sauron's command were not returned to their original owners whole. Some frayed ends carried echoes of deeds made under compulsion, made in shadow, and those deeds now hung orphaned in the memory of the world. A horse that had borne a rider to commit an atrocity would stand later and not remember the hand that guided it. Songs would be sung in halls about a rescue that had saved a town, and no singer could name the face that had done it. The deeds themselves preserved, but the owners, as if taken by wind, were without the memory of having acted. Heroes were described as one who came from the black or an unknown hand, and in the telling, their courage became legend without name. Where compulsion had bound, some minds woke with a hollow. In the first days, the hollow felt like relief. Soldiers who once obeyed a single, impossible command breathed as though surfacing from river-deep waters. They panicked, wept, laughed with a sudden, jagged freedom, but in the hollow there was also loss, a compass star gone from the skies. They reached for reasons for their deeds and found only blank parchment. Some sought to stitch back meaning by trial and repentance. Others turned away, fearing the work of hands they could not recall. Small communities were left to reckon with actions whose provenance had vanished, and the work of reconciliation fell upon those who remembered. In the courts and in the green places, those who had been instruments became the living. In a glade where a march had once been marshaled by threat, a gardener sat on the root of an ancient tree and felt the world's pulse. He had marched before he no longer knew why. He had been cruel, perhaps even murderous. He could not summon the face of the man he had once been when another's will had claimed him. He lowered his head, and the tears came without shame. Galadriel, who had read the weave before Neo's hand, watched these slow awakenings with the pale, terrible wisdom of the Eldar. There was gratitude in her face, and a sorrow older than mountains. Freedom, she seemed to say without speech, is not simply the ending of a chain. It is the taking up of responsibility for what the chain once forced you to do. The land itself changed. Rivers flowed with a different music. Where once a highway thrummed like a wound with the tread of compelled feet, Grasses grew in tumbling waves. The air tasted fresher in the mouths of the lowlands and smelled faintly of iron and rain in the high passes where the strength of will had been greatest. The trees that had whispered only of loss found new words to say. Yet under that renewal lay mourning. Places where malice had concentrated left behind a residue of memory that was not harmful, but was heavy. Fields remembered the tread of boots. Wells remembered the thirst of armies. Even stone held a shadow of the command that had made it hammer and hew. When elves walked the borders of such places, they placed a hand upon the rock and listened. Some of them wept as if for friends. Not all changes were sorrowful. There were small reversals. A foal that had been blind under compulsion blinked and saw. A child raised for a purpose she had never chosen laughed at a joke she had not learned, and that laughter spread like seed. People discovered one another afresh, as if meeting for the first time in a familiar town. Bonds once stretched taut by fear loosened into new, fragile trust. Councils opened windows. Deals once made in the dark were reconsidered in light. It would be a long time before old wounds healed, but the ability to heal had been returned. Neo stood at the edge of the silence and felt a change within himself, too. He had come as one who could unmake a thing of will. He had expected the liberation, the collapse of a great tyranny, and he had seen its immediate effects. But there was a lesson that no other world had taught him so plainly. To delete a tyrant's code is not only to silence the tyrant, it is to remake the future that tyrant shaped. Where once a single weave guided thousands, now there were threads left to the currents of chance and intention. That unmooring required guardianship. He learned this with the clarity of a bell struck in the dusk. Without Sauron's force, bargains and prophecies would drift. A deed once coerced might become a forgotten scar. The world could unravel in smaller, quieter ways, not by evil will, but by neglect. People would need help to remember with truth. Names misplaced by the unthreading needed reclaiming or graceful letting go. New tyrannies might grow from the soil cleared by the old. Where once the eye watched and terrorized, now the vacuum might be filled by petty ambition or by despair, both of which would wear the face of harmlessness at first. He moved among those newly freed, not as an overlord, but as a witness. He listened when a hobbit in a field spoke of dreams of smoke and of marching. He knelt by a man who could not remember why he had torched a granary and took the man's hand until the tremor passed. He began to teach clumsy, foreign lessons about choice and consequence. He told stories, not of machines and code, but of small decisions and their ripples. An old ranger who had borne a blade for 1,000 dark things sat in the firelight and asked, "Will you stay?" He did not ask for a pledge in form. He asked because someone had to keep watch over the places where the weave had been cut. Neo replied with a look that carried 2 worlds' worth of weariness and hope. He would guard, but his guarding would not be of the sort that binds. He would guard like a gardener who tends a cleared bed. He would plant markers to remember where names had been lost. He would note those who woke with a hollow and help them reconstruct their story or help them begin a new one. He would keep vigil at thresholds where the old influence had been strongest, listening for any strange stitchings of will that might begin anew. He would teach tools of discernment, of law, of collective memory. In doing so, he would accept a burden born of his undoing. Yet, even as he set himself to this task, he felt the gravity of other responsibilities reach him. There were places where the weave's collapse had not only freed but unmoored things worse than mere compulsion. Old barrows sniffed at the loosened pattern of fate, ancient malice, not entirely Sauron's, dormant and patient, raised its head and tasted air it had not breathed in ages. Neo felt a prickle along the edge of his understanding, as if something else had noticed the quiet. A shifting of purpose, like a shadow stepping into the corner of a room, may not be violence, but it is intent. He smelled it in the dust on a doorway and in the way ravens watched the hills. It required vigilance of a kind he had not expected. He also felt guilt. The world owed much to those whose deeds had been taken and anonymized. There were myriad small honors to pay, named stones, songs that might speak truly, acts of atonement that acknowledged the absence as well as the presence of past deeds. Neo began the long, necessary work of restoring not force, but memory. He would travel to halls where songs were sung and sit with bards until new verses found their shape. He would help build memorials that did not glorify deeds born of compulsion, but that marked the suffering and the courage intertwined in those dark years. These were humble tasks, the sort that repair the fabric of communal life. Night after night, he walked between the remains of the loom and the living world, feeling out phrase and echoes, correcting course where accident threatened to become despotism. Those who followed him were few at first. An elf who had seen too many ages, a ranger with a face like winter stone, a young woman who remembered for 2 and wept for 1,000. Together, they founded a small order whose charge was not dominion, but remembering. They called themselves by no grand name. They stayed up late by fires to write down the names they could salvage. They taught children how to ask and how to forgive. Their tools were paper, memory, and the patience of many small hands. But the new peace was precarious. In the castles that remained whole, men whispered of the power vacuum as if it were a feast laid out before them. In the wild places, creatures unmoored by the old pattern roamed with new cunning. Some among the freed, unable to endure the open sky of choice, sank into darkness out of despair. Neo knew that cutting the thread had been a decisive act, but it had been only the beginning. He felt destiny fold and refold itself beneath his feet. The world had changed course, and that course demanded tending. At dawn on the 20th day after the fall of the eye, Neo climbed the basalt ridge that faced the ruined tower. Below, Barad-dûr lay like a beast in sleep. Above, the sky was a clean silver sheet. He set a small stone upon the cairn the rangers had made and whispered a promise that was part prayer and part vow. He would not claim mastery of Middle-earth's fate. He would not bind it again. He would keep watch. He would honor loss with names where he could and celebrate the new lives that sprang from freedom. He would teach steadiness in a fragile age. A wind rose then, carrying with it a scent that was neither holy oak nor holy iron, but a mixture of both. It touched his face as if testing him. Neo felt the hum of the world answer back in a dozen small ways. A bell in a distant hall, a child's laughter across a green, the creak of a village gate swung open for the first time in years. He tightened his cloak against the cold and turned his head toward the west, where rumor said new gatherings were forming. There were threads still to find, to mend, to let go. He shouldered the quiet responsibility he had made and walked down the ridge, each step an intention toward a future not yet written. His journey had become a guardianship. and the next step would decide whether that guardianship would be gentle stewardship or a new pattern that might become a chain.